top 10 decks for the month of June 2023. I just want to thank everyone that came out and liked last month's video. Now, this list is going to be a little bit different than my other list. We are going to cover the best decks in the game right now, but I think something that is very important to consider is that we are getting a Battle Pass card, Ghost Spider, so there are going to be a lot of people playing move decks. High Evolutionary has changed the game and is everywhere. And lastly, there is the new Conquest mode, which may have very different deck lists. And it also will provide an environment where people can play casually, essentially an unranked mode. That being said, we're going to just start off with the best decks in the game. And like I said, High Evolutionary has changed everything. This is a traditional Sarah control build that got a lot better with Kitty Pryde. And the first couple of decks that we're going to go over all have Kitty Pryde. She is absolutely amazing, and her synergies with Bishop and Angela are over the top. And the main downside to Kitty Pryde is that there really is not a way of playing a 6-cost card with her, because then you have to choose between playing a 6-cost card or your ramped up Kitty. Of course, Kitty Pryde is much better if you draw her early, and that's where this tech absolutely explodes. Oftentimes I find myself snapping early after I've seen a couple of the locations, 2 or 3 locations, and I'm already ramping up my Kitty Pryde. That's usually a setup for victory. And then, of course, Sarah, snapping before you play Sarah on turn 5 is an excellent strategy. Now, this deck build is running Luke Cage because of High Evolutionary being everywhere. Traditionally, this build ran Scarlet Witch instead. In the same vein of Sarah control, I very much like this build. Also, it's a little bit different. It doesn't quite go down the path of Hitmonkey, but rather it takes advantage of Zabu, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, Typhoid, Mary. So this has leaned into the Luke Cage idea. Also running Hazmat, and this deck build has Scarlet Witch, which is one of my favorite cards in Sarah control builds. My suggestion is to not play Scarlet Witch on curve. The idea is to play Sarah on 5 and then hold on to your surprise cards, whether that is Scarlet Witch, Shang-Chi, Enchantress, or even Luke Cage, and play those on 6 and steal cubes from your opponent. Bounce decks. There's a couple versions of this bounce deck. I want to say this one right here does run America Chavez and Kitty Pryde, which I initially thought would be a problem, but it's not. If you're able to pick up Kitty Pryde with Beast, well, the deck gets out of control when that happens, by the way. You're still able to play America Chavez on turn 6 and Kitty Pryde 4-0. This deck does require a small learning curve. You have to control your hand size because you are bouncing cards back to your hand with Beast and Falcon. I actually prefer the version of this deck that does not play America Chavez and it runs Korg instead, and so that there is not that interaction that sometimes happens with Kitty Pryde and America Chavez. In the same vein of control and Kitty Pryde, this is another build that does very well. It seems very simple on paper, but the idea is to play Daredevil, take advantage of Gamora. Gamora is one of the best 5-drops. You can play her on turn 6 at the same time as Kitty Pryde. Locking them out with Spider-Man is a fun time, and then Jeff moves around, which also allows Spider-Man Miles Morales to be lower cost. Nightcrawler also triggers that. Very good build, very solid. Now, I do want to talk about what I think will be the best deck in the game going forward. This deck right here runs Professor X, and that will absolutely destroy move decks. I really wanted to start the video with this deck right here. This is the deck that I'm going to be playing. right out of the gate when the new season starts and Ghost Biter is everywhere. I also think that this deck will do well in the new Conquest mode. High evolutionary builds are very flexible and are not exposed to a lot of weaknesses. I find they have a ton of favorable matchups. Now, the two cards, of course, that are going to be relatively good counters to move decks, because move decks are going to be a thing, is going to be Kingpin and Professor X. Kingpin is more of a specific card that works under those circumstances, where Professor X works in many situations. So I'm not so much interested in the Kingpin card or slotting in Kingpin just because of move decks. I am, however, very interested in running Professor X and this build here. And I know a lot of people always ask about substitutions for Jeff. You could try Nightcrawler. You could try Daredevil if you want to put a 2-drop. But really, Jeff is hard to replace. I think he's one of the best Series 5 cards out there, which is very expensive. I would definitely purchase High Evolutionary before Jeff, but Jeff, for me, has given me so much value. I use him in so many decks. Every day I play Jeff, and he has won me so many games. I do recommend Jeff. Now, we're going to continue talking about High Evolutionary decks. I do think that this is the best one. Another High Evolutionary deck that I've played, which is kind of like a standard High Evolutionary deck. It does run Wave. We've talked about how crazy Wave can be on turn 5 in this deck right here in particular, because you play Wave on turn 5, you're still not spending energy, which is good for Misty Knight. It's good for Cyclops. It's ramping up your Hulk, and then you're able to play Hulk on the last turn. I do think that High Evolutionary is an amazing card, and as a 3-piece can be placed in a lot of decks. And what I mean by that is I think going forward, we're going to see High Evolutionary with Wasp and Hulk only. Those 3 cards right there are just absolutely over the top good. Of course, I very much like Thing, very much like Cyclops. And Cyclops is just a great card in general, especially if you're running Storm. This deck does run Debris, which does provide some counterplay to Galactus decks, which I think is the natural weakness to this type of deck is going to be Galactus. I mean, what do you do against Galactus, right? Well, Debris can help with that. And then it does run the Hazmat Luke Cage combo. Lockjaw. This is a good build, and I believe this is the best Lockjaw build for High Evolutionary. And you'll see what I was describing earlier, where this build runs the 3-piece High Evolutionary, Hulk, and Wasp. I'm not a super big fan of Lockjaw, Dracula, Jubilee builds. They're the casino, very random, but this deck does get good results. And if you're gonna play this style of deck, I would definitely recommend using a tracker of some sort, like the one right here above me. It helps keep track of what's going on in the game. That can be used on your Steam client. I'm sponsored by untap.gg. Link to that tracker is in the description. And then I guess we just have to mention Galactus. Galactus with Killmonger and Daredevil seems very meta right now. Kitty Pryde's a thing, Nebula's a thing, Sunspot's a thing, and having the ability to kill them seems pretty good to have null food and death fodder, absolutely. Daredevil is one of my preferred cards on Galactus builds because, if your opponent is running a counter, because Galactus plays are very well telegraphed, having Daredevil makes it so that you're not surprised by their counterplay, like a random Cosmo or an Arrow that just destroys your plans. So I very much like Daredevil. Discard is still very, very good. There are other discard builds out there that run Swordmaster and Hellcow. I prefer this build right here, which doesn't have a random effect that accidentally discards your MODOK or something like that. Discard decks are very powerful. I'm glad that they are doing well right now, and it's very enjoyable to play. I do think Nebula made this particular discard archetype better. And a lot of people say, why is Storm there? Well, you can play Storm with Nebula, Morbius, or Dracula. There's synergy there, right? Where you're able to put those cards with Storm in a lane, and you're going to lock out that lane. Dracula does that, Morbius does that, and so does Nebula. And lastly, I got to give a shout out to Silver Surfer. This deck puts up the numbers, and this has some reasonable tech to High Evolutionary with Luke Cage and Rogue, and so it is still performing very well. That being said, the deck that I'm the most interested in starting my climb to infinite is going to be this deck here, without a doubt. This should shut down move decks. This deck has favorable matchups against most of the archetypes, and this is the build that I'm going to be using for sure to get my run to infinite. I'm also going to use this deck in the Conquest mode to see how that plays out. I will be making videos about the Conquest mode. The Conquest mode decks are going to be different than ladder build decks for sure, specifically because the matches are longer. Your opponent knows what you're playing. It gives them an opportunity to snap earlier and more often if they know that they have a favorable matchup to you. It's just an entirely different game mode. And also trying to hit multiple win streaks in that mode makes it to want to have more consistent type builds. And I believe this is a consistent type build that has a lot of favorable matchups. Let me know what you think in the comment section. Let me know what's working for you. And as always, thanks for watching. Keep on gaming. Bye for now.